You wake up, look in the mirror, and the first thing your eyes lock onto is that same stubborn curve pushing against your clothes, that same shape that refuses to disappear no matter how disciplined you think you've been, no matter how many nights you went to bed slightly hungry, convincing yourself that this time things would finally change. You try tightening your stomach, pulling it in just slightly, hoping maybe today it looks flatter, but the moment you relax, it drops right back out, almost like something inside is pushing against you from within. And that's the part nobody explains to you. They tell you it's fat. They tell you it's calories. They tell you to move more, eat less, punish yourself a little harder. But what if the thing you've been trying to burn off isn't the real problem at all? Because I need you to think about something very carefully. If this was only about fat, then why do people who are not overweight still struggle with the exact same protruding belly? Why do people who follow strict diets, who track every gram of food, still stand there confused when the rest of their body leans out, but their abdomen refuses to follow? There is a missing piece here, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In fact, it will change the way you understand your own body completely. Right now, as you're sitting or standing, there is pressure building inside your abdomen. Not the kind you feel after eating too much, not temporary bloating, but a constant, silent force pressing outward. Most people ignore it because it becomes their normal, but normal does not mean healthy. And this pressure isn't random, it has a source. A physical, structural source that no one ever points out because it doesn't fit into the simple narrative of just lose weight. Your abdominal wall is not designed to hold back unlimited internal force. It's a layered structure, skin, fat, connective tissue, muscle, all working together to maintain shape and stability. Under ideal conditions, everything inside your abdominal cavity is supported and positioned correctly. Your organs are not supposed to sag, not supposed to collapse downward, not supposed to rest heavily against the lower abdomen. But when that internal support system weakens, something shifts. Literally. Your intestines, which should be held higher and supported, begin to descend, slowly, subtly, almost unnoticeably at first. There's no sudden pain, no dramatic warning sign, just a gradual shift downward. And once they drop, they don't just disappear into empty space. They occupy the lower abdominal region, a space that was never meant to carry that kind of constant load. So what happens next? They press forward. And that forward pressure is what you're seeing in the mirror. This is where everything starts to make sense, because suddenly that stubborn belly is no longer just fat. It's structure, it's positioning, it's physics. You are not just dealing with what's on the outside. You are dealing with what's happening inside. And if that internal pressure isn't addressed, no amount of dieting will fully fix it. Now here's where it gets more serious. And this is the part most people overlook completely. That downward shift doesn't just affect how your belly looks, it starts interfering with systems you rely on every single day without even thinking about them. Blood flow, for example. The veins responsible for carrying blood from your lower body back to your heart pass directly through the area where this pressure builds. When something heavy sits on top of them, that flow slows down. And when blood slows down, it doesn't just politely wait, it accumulates. That's when you start noticing heaviness in your legs, especially after standing for long periods. That's when veins begin to appear more prominently, twisting slightly, becoming more visible under the skin. At first it's subtle, easy to ignore, but over time it progresses. And you're told it's just aging, just genetics, just something to live with. But it's not random, it's mechanical. And the same pressure doesn't stop there. It affects everything in that region. Your bladder starts feeling it. That constant urge to go, even when there's barely anything there. Waking up at night, interrupting your sleep, thinking it's just hydration or stress. It's not, it's pressure. Your digestive system feels it too. Food doesn't move as smoothly. You feel heavier after meals, slower. Sometimes uncomfortable in a way you can't quite explain. And again, it becomes your normal, something you adjust to instead of question. But here's the moment where things shift. Because once you understand that this is not just about burning something away, but about lifting something back into place, everything changes. The strategy changes, the goal changes, the results change. And this is where most people make a critical mistake. They try to fix a structural issue with metabolic solutions. They starve, restrict, overtrain, hoping that eventually the body will shrink into the shape they want. But structure doesn't respond to starvation. Position doesn't correct itself through calorie deficits. You can reduce fat, yes, but if something inside is still pressing outward, the shape won't fully change. So the real question becomes, what happens if you reverse that pressure? What happens if instead of trying to flatten your stomach from the outside, you remove the force pushing it out from the inside? Because that's where things start to get interesting. There is a very specific way to influence internal positioning. Not through machines, not through extreme workouts, but through controlled, deliberate movement that directly interacts with the structures involved. It's subtle, but powerful. And when done correctly, it doesn't just mask the problem. It begins to reverse it. But here's the catch. Almost nobody does it correctly the first time, because it requires something most people aren't used to. Full control over their breath, their abdominal muscles, and their awareness of what's happening inside their body. And when even one part is off, the effect weakens. That's why so many people try something once, feel nothing, and assume it doesn't work. But when it clicks, the difference is undeniable, and this is exactly where people start noticing the first changes. Not dramatic overnight transformations, but subtle shifts. A slight reduction in pressure. A different feeling when standing. A sense that something inside is no longer pushing as hard as it used to, and that's just the beginning. Because over the next few weeks, those small changes start stacking. The body begins to respond. Systems that were under pressure begin to ease. Circulation improves. Discomfort reduces. And visually, something starts to happen that catches people off guard. The belly doesn't just shrink, it changes shape. But before that happens, there's one critical mistake that can completely ruin the process. And almost everyone makes it without realizing. That mistake usually begins the moment someone feels even the slightest improvement, because the human mind is wired to rush results, to speed things up, to push harder the second it senses progress. And that instinct, the one that tells you to go faster, to breathe quicker, to finish the movement as soon as possible, is exactly what cancels the effect you're trying to create. The body does not respond to rushed correction, it responds to precise control. The difference between something working and something failing here is not effort, it is accuracy. And most people, without realizing it, replace accuracy with urgency. They exhale halfway instead of completely, because holding that empty state feels uncomfortable. They pull their abdomen in slightly, but not deeply enough to create that true internal lift. They move their hands quickly, almost brushing over the surface instead of applying intentional pressure. And then they say it didn't work, but what they actually did was never give their body the signal it needed in the first place. Because this is not just a movement, it's a sequence, a chain reaction. Each step sets up the next one, and if the first step is incomplete, everything that follows loses its power. When the lungs are not fully emptied, the diaphragm doesn't rise as high as it should. When the diaphragm doesn't rise, the internal space doesn't shift. And when that space doesn't shift, the organs remain exactly where they were, still pressing forward, still creating that same outward force. Now imagine doing that incorrectly every day for a week. Nothing changes, so you assume it's useless. You go back to what you were doing before. Crunches, restrictions, frustration. And the real solution gets dismissed, not because it failed, but because it was never executed properly. But when someone finally does it right, truly right, something very specific happens in that moment of full exhale. There is a brief window where the internal pressure drops, where the diaphragm lifts upward, and the abdominal cavity experiences a temporary shift in dynamics. That window is where the repositioning begins. It's subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but internally it's significant. And then comes the second phase, the one most people underestimate. Drawing the abdomen inward is not about appearance. It's not about sucking in your stomach the way people casually do in front of a mirror. This is deeper. This is controlled contraction that pulls the abdominal wall inward toward the spine, creating space and encouraging upward movement of what has been pressing downward for so long. At this stage, many people panic slightly because the urge to breathe becomes stronger. That discomfort is not a warning sign. It is confirmation that you are finally reaching the depth required for the exercise to work. And this is exactly where most people break. They inhale too early, they release too soon, and the sequence collapses. But if they hold just a few seconds longer, if they maintain that inward draw, something begins to shift. And that leads into the third phase, the one that directly interacts with the external structure, the manual lift. This is where intention matters more than strength. The fingertips are not just touching the skin. They are guiding the tissue upward, applying steady pressure, moving from the lowest point of the abdomen upward in a controlled path. It's not fast, it's not aggressive, it's deliberate, and that upward motion reinforces what the internal pressure change has already initiated. Think of it as aligning two forces, the internal lift created by breath control and the external guidance created by your hands. When those two forces move together, the effect multiplies. When they are disconnected, the effect disappears. Now here's where it becomes even more interesting, because the body doesn't just respond in isolation, it adapts. The more consistently the sequence is performed correctly, the more the surrounding structures begin to adjust. The connective tissues, the ligaments that have been under constant strain, begin to experience a different kind of load. Not downward pull, but upward support. And over time, that changes how they behave, but this is not immediate. This is where patience becomes the deciding factor between success and failure, because the first visible changes often take days, sometimes weeks, and during that time, doubt creeps in. You start questioning whether it's worth continuing, whether this is just another thing that promises results but delivers nothing. That doubt is what stops most people right before the turning point, because the turning point does come, and when it does, it's not subtle anymore. It starts with small signs. You wake up and notice your abdomen feels slightly different, not flatter necessarily, but less tense. Less pushed outward. Your posture changes without effort. Standing feels lighter. Sitting feels more comfortable. And these changes are easy to ignore if you're only focused on visual results. But internally, something is shifting. Circulation begins to improve. The heaviness in the lower body starts to reduce. That constant sense of pressure, the one you didn't even realize you were carrying all day, begins to fade. And this is where people start noticing something unexpected. Their energy changes, because when the body is no longer fighting constant internal resistance, everything becomes more efficient. Movement feels easier, fatigue reduces, even breathing feels slightly different, deeper, more controlled. And then comes the visual change. Not dramatic at first, just a slight flattening when you're relaxed, not forcing anything, not holding your breath, just standing naturally. And that's the moment people realize this is different. This is not temporary. This is not a trick of lighting or posture. Something real is happening. But here's the part nobody tells you. Right before these visible changes become consistent, there is often a phase where things feel off. Your body is adjusting, structures are shifting, circulation patterns are changing. And during that adjustment, you might feel sensations you didn't expect. Mild soreness, a dull ache, sometimes a feeling of unfamiliar pressure moving through the abdomen. It's not pain in the dangerous sense, but it's enough to make you question whether you should continue. And this is where most people stop. They interpret adaptation as a problem. They think something is wrong, when in reality, their body is responding exactly the way it should. Because when tissues that have been compressed for a long time suddenly experience improved blood flow, they react. That reaction is part of recovery, not a sign of damage. But if you don't understand that, you quit. And if you quit here, you never reach the stage where everything stabilizes, where the improvements become consistent, where the body fully adapts to its corrected positioning. Because stability is the final phase. And reaching that phase requires something most people struggle with more than anything else: consistency. Not intensity, not perfection. Just repetition, done correctly, over time. And this is exactly where the real transformation begins to separate those who get results from those who stay stuck in the same cycle. Because there is one more factor, one that accelerates everything if you understand it, and completely slows you down if you ignore it. That final factor is something most people never even consider because it doesn't feel as immediate or as visible as movement or effort, but it quietly determines how fast your body can actually adapt to what you're doing. And that factor is the condition of your connective tissue, the very structures responsible for holding everything in place, the ligaments, the fascia, the internal support network that either keeps your organs lifted or allows them to fall. You can perform the movement perfectly, you can stay consistent, you can avoid every common mistake, but if the tissue responsible for maintaining that new position is weak, slow to recover, or under constant stress, progress becomes slower than it should be. Not impossible, just slower. And that's where most people get frustrated, because they are doing everything right, but not seeing results at the speed they expected. And here's the part that changes how you approach this entirely. Your connective tissue is alive. It responds to what you do daily. It rebuilds, strengthens, and adapts based on the signals you give it. But unlike muscle, it doesn't respond quickly. It doesn't grow overnight. It doesn't change in a week. It requires sustained, repeated input over time. And when it finally adapts, the change is stable, long-lasting, not something that disappears the moment you stop paying attention. This is why some people notice early improvements but fail to maintain them. They create the initial shift, but they don't give their body enough time to lock it in place. So slowly, almost invisibly, things drift back to where they were, not because the method failed, but because the process was incomplete. Now imagine doing the opposite. Imagine not stopping when you see the first signs of progress, but continuing through that phase, allowing your body to fully adapt, fully strengthen, fully stabilize. That's when the changes stop being temporary and start becoming your new normal. And this is where the timeline matters. In the first few weeks, you notice changes in pressure, in comfort, in subtle visual shifts. In the next phase, those changes become more consistent. The abdomen stays flatter for longer periods without effort. The sense of internal heaviness continues to decrease. And then, over the following months, something deeper happens. Your body stops fighting gravity the way it used to. Because the structures supporting your organs are no longer as weak as they were, they begin to hold, to support, to resist that constant downward pull that has been shaping your body for years. And once that support improves, everything above it benefits. Your posture naturally adjusts. You stand straighter without thinking about it. Your core feels engaged even when you're not consciously tightening it. Your movements become more efficient, less strained. And the most noticeable change, the one that started this entire process, the outward pressure on your abdomen continues to fade. But here's where things take an unexpected turn, because once that internal pressure reduces significantly, you begin to see your body differently. Areas that once looked like stubborn fat start revealing their true nature. Some of it was never fat to begin with. It was shape distortion caused by internal force. And as that force disappears, the shape corrects itself. That's why the transformation doesn't look like typical weight loss. It looks cleaner, more natural, more structural, the kind of change people notice but can't quite explain. They might think you've lost weight, even if the scale hasn't changed much. They might ask what you've been doing differently, expecting some strict diet or intense workout routine. But the real answer is much simpler. You remove the force that was pushing everything out of place. And once that happens, your body does what it was always designed to do: function efficiently, maintain balance, and hold its structure without constant strain. Now, there is one more phase that most people don't talk about, because by the time you reach it, the urgency is gone. The problem that once bothered you every single day is no longer dominating your thoughts. And that phase is maintenance. This is where you decide whether the results you achieved remain or slowly fade. Because gravity never stops. Every single day, whether you're aware of it or not, it continues to act on your body. Every step, every movement, every hour spent upright adds to that load. And while your body is now better equipped to handle it, it still requires minimal support to maintain that balance. The difference is, maintenance is not demanding. It's not time-consuming. It doesn't require intense focus, just a small, consistent effort to remind your body of the position it needs to hold. A short repetition of the same sequence, done correctly, enough to reinforce what has already been built. And this is where most people either secure their results or slowly lose them. Not because the method stopped working, but because they stopped applying it. Consistency creates the result, and consistency maintains it. Now think about where you are right now. Think about how long you've been trying to fix something that never fully responded to what you were doing. Think about the frustration of putting in effort without seeing the change you expected. And then consider this. What if the issue was never your discipline? What if it was never about how hard you tried, but about what you were actually targeting? Because once you correct the target, everything else becomes simpler. You don't need extremes. You don't need constant struggle. You just need to apply the right method correctly and give your body the time it needs to respond. And when it does respond, the difference is not just visible, it's undeniable. But here's the part that most people ignore, even after understanding all of this. They delay starting. They tell themselves they'll begin tomorrow, next week, when they have more time, when they feel more ready. And that delay is what keeps the problem exactly where it is. Because nothing changes until something is actually done. So the real question isn't whether this works. The real question is whether you will actually apply it long enough to see the result. Because once you do, you'll realize the one thing that was holding you back this entire time wasn't effort, wasn't genetics, wasn't even your habits. It was the fact that no one ever showed you what was really happening inside your body.